Welcome to this next video, on the beginner's guide to Ruby on Rails 7. And in this video, we're going to talk about an associated model. An associated model is a model that has a relationship with a model that we've already created, the task model. We're going to create a notes model where we can have notes about the task we want to complete. Now, in database relationships, there are different kinds of relationships, a many-to-one relationship. And that's what we're going to focus on in this video, and how to create a many-to-one relationship. So there will be one task that has many notes, and each note will belong to a task. But Ruby on Rails has support for different database relationships, including a many-to-many relationship, and then also a many-to-many through relationship. Now, the difference with a many-to-many through is that we want to collect information about the relationship itself. For instance, if a student is taking a course, we might want to include the grade the student got in the course. So if there's information about the relationship, then you would do a many-to-many through. And then there is also a one-to-one relationship that Ruby on Rails supports. You can look on guides on how to create all of these, but in this one, we'll focus on a many-to-one relationship. Now, just like in the previous video when we created a task, we're going to go ahead and use the generator to create a notes model. So we're going to do bin Rails G for generate, and this time we're going to create a model. Now, if you remember, we want to use a singular version of the model, which is going to be note. And this note will have a title, which will be a string, so we do not need to put the database type after the colon. And then we're also going to have a body, which have a body of text. Now we could have this be a string, but we can also allow for multiple line comments and use the colon text or the text database type when we create that. Now, Ruby on Rails does a lot to help with the associations, but you still have to set up your database correctly. So you need to know how to create a many-to-one database relationship. And since the note model is the one that's on the many side, there can be many notes that belong to one task, he needs to have the foreign key of the task. So there has to be a task ID field in this, and that's going to be an integer. And this will be the foreign key for the task model. So we do have to include that in there, and Rails uses a lot of defaults. So the default for the foreign key is the name of the model. Notice it's singular _ID. So that will be the foreign key, and we'll go ahead and run that. And of course, you can check out your migration file, make sure everything is correct. And then we can go ahead and run that migration to create the notes model in our database. Now, this did create a notes model file for us so that we can go ahead and open that up. And our note model is right here, and we can add some validations. So we'll validate, so we'll just make sure that the title is present. So now we can go ahead and try creating a note in the console. Now you don't have to do this when you're developing. You can move right on into creating the controller, but just for this demo video, I like to show how you can interact with this note in the console. That way it helps you understand what we're doing when we create the controller. So we can go ahead and create a new note. And as you can see, the note has a title, body, and a task ID. So we can give this note a title. We'll call this the console note. And then the body. And then this note needs to belong to a task. So that means that we can't let this task ID field stay nil, or else this note would be orphaned. It wouldn't belong to any task. So to find a task, we can just look at, say, t equals task dot first. And you can notice that the task, the ID is 3. So we can say n dot task ID equals 3 and assign that and save that. That's a little bit of work to look at a task and find its ID and assign the ID. Ruby on Rails can really help us out. When we manage this relationship, it can give us helper fields so that we can find the notes that belong to a task and assign a note to a task really easily, instead of always looking at the ID. For example, if we wanted to find all the tasks, we have this task, right? And its ID is 3. So if we want to find all of that task's notes, we'd have to go note.where, and the task ID is 3. So we'd have to add that in there to be able to get all of the notes that belong to that task. And that's a little bit of extra work. So let's go ahead and jump back into the code and create this association. Let the Rails code know about this association so it can help us manage this relationship a lot better. So back in the note model, we can add a line of code that says that this belongs to a task. And this one line of code will go ahead and create this association. So back in the console now, sometimes it's a good idea to exit and re-enter the console to make sure that we've reloaded the new code. And now we can say n equals note dot first, get that note that we created out from the database, and that's a capital N since we're calling this method on the class. And then we can go n.task, and it gives us the task that this note belongs to. So that's what this line of code adds, this variable or this method onto our note that we can call to be able to get that note's tasks. So that's a really nice feature. And then we can even say n.task equals some task that we have, and we can assign it that way. So now we no longer need to look at the IDs to make the connection between a note and a task. So we can also do this on the task side, and we can say that this task has many notes. Now, if you notice, this is a plural name of the note model and not the singular, because that's just better English. And also because the task is the one side and the notes is the many side, this in the task, the one side of the relationship, it has many notes. And in the note model, it belongs to a task. So you got to make sure you put the belongs to in the model whose database has the foreign key, and the has many goes in the model that doesn't have any foreign key to set this up correctly. But now that we've set that up with our task model, we can re-enter the console, and we can say t equals task.first. And this is the model that has the note on it. So we can say t.notes, and it will pull out all of the notes in the database. You can even see that it writes the SQL statement for us. Now this, if you notice, is an array. We got the square brackets around it. So since it is an array, we can perform array operations on this. We can loop through each note. We can append notes into this, which is awesome because it will automatically set the ID on the note and save it in the database. So this is how we can create the relationship, at least on the database level. So now let's go ahead and create our user interface by creating some controllers and views. So the way that we'll start creating our user interface is on our task show page. This is when we're viewing an individual task. Right here, we can have a link that goes to all of the and displays all of the notes that belong to a task. So the first step is we're going to need to create a controller. And again, we'll call this the notes controller. And this is just like we did with the task model. And we'll create that index action. The index action displays all of the notes. But we don't want it to display all of the notes in our database, just the notes that belong to a certain task. So we'll see how we do that a little later, but first let's create this controller. Now in this case, it's good that we know how to create controllers from scratch, because now we're probably going to get to the area where we're going to have to modify the scaffold so much for this notes controller that it's really not worth using. Whereas if we're doing a task model, it's probably still worth using the scaffold in that case. So now we have this new notes controller, but the other thing that was created was the routes file. So in the config routes folder, it created this route but we don't want the route. We still want the resources, so we could add in another resources notes like that. But that means, and I'm just going to use this area down here as a little scratch board. You don't want to add this into your code. But that means that all of our URLs will be /notes to see all of our notes, and then this will be to see a specific note. But what we want is we want the notes to be nested underneath our task. So if we're seeing task number 3, and then we go to the notes URL, that will get all the notes that belong to task number 3. So by nesting this, we can kind of limit which notes that we show. And if we want to see a specific note, like the first note, this note hopefully belongs to task number 3. So how do we nest those routes? And we do that by making this a block. We add a block. So this is just a Ruby block. And then inside of that block, we can add the routes that we want to be nested underneath a task. So by the way, there is no /tasks and then /notes. There's no reason why we'd look at notes without knowing how they're related to a specific task. So we always have to have this ID located in there. So that's, and then this again is going to link up all 7 of those actions that we did in the last video, the index, the create, and everything else. So now, since we want to add a link on this task show page to see our notes, we need to edit the task show view. So inside of our views, we have the show view under the tasks, and this is what we want to edit. And we have a link to edit the tasks, a link to go back to all the tasks, a button to delete the task, but we can also add a link to our notes, and we'll just have the link say notes. And that wants to go to the tasks, the task notes path. So in this, we also need to incorporate the task because the task ID needs to be part of this URL. So we're looking at one task and we want to view all of the notes inside that belong to that one task. So that's the helper method that will create the link. So again, that link will be /tasks, and then we'll have the ID in there and then notes. So save this, and then refreshing, we get this notes path right here, and we can click on that, and now we're on the notes index page. So let's go ahead and open up the notes folder inside of the views, and we have that index path. And up here, we can have the title, and we can maybe do something fancy, say notes for, and then add in the tasks title, or not the title, but the name of the task. And then in order to have this task variable here, though, we better load it inside of the controller. So let's open up that notes controller. We have this index action, and what we want to do is set that task variable to be task.find, and then in our params, to pull that ID that's in the URL out, we have the params, the task ID in there. So whenever we have the task / some ID and then notes, this ID right here will be loaded in through this params right there. Now, the one thing is we're going to pretty much want this task loaded out for all of our actions in this controller. So let's do this in a before filter. All right, before action will load the task. And to do that, we'll down here in the private area, we'll create that load task method. And inside of that, we'll just do this code right there. And so now in our other actions, we'll know that we can access the task through that variable right there. It'll get loaded in every one of our actions. And refreshing, and now we have the notes for it, and then we have this name, the name of the task. So now we can take the task, take all of the notes that belong to that task and loop through them and create a little div tag that contains the information about that note, like the title and the body. Now notice this DOM ID note here. It will create an ID that's specific to that note. And if we refresh, we get the console note, the note that we created in the console. Now you'll probably want to do some CSS here to make these look a little bit nicer, but we'll move on and add a link here to create new notes that belong to this task. So we can add that link here below, and we also will make the link look like a button. And refreshing, we have a new note link here, but we can see that we need to create the new action in our notes controller. So again, if you look at the URL, we have the tasks and the tasks that we're currently viewing, and we're going to create a new note on that task. And this is the helper method that creates that URL. And you can see it's a new task note path, but we have to give it the task so it can put the ID in the URL. And here we'll just create our new method. And we already have this task variable loaded out because there's a before action. It's going to call this method, and we're going to set this task instance variable up here. But we, just like in the task controller, we do need a note that is a brand new note. Of course, the note, we're going to need a view. Of course, we're going to need a view for this new note. So let's go ahead and create a new file, and this will be new.html.erb. And we can give this a title, and then we can create a form to create a new note. Now the form's going to look a lot like the form that we used to create tasks, except for this is going to be on a note. So we only need a title and a body. We'll still use this error message right here in case they leave the title blank. And if you notice, we did a bootstrap form with, but this time we pass in an array. And that array, Rails is really smart. We basically need to know how to create the URL to create new notes. So the URL that this form wants to submit to is the tasks with the ID in it, and then it's /notes. And we're going to make a post request to this, so this will get routed to the notes create action. Now, by passing in this array here, Rails is really smart. It asks this thing what it is, and it says, I'm an array. And it says, okay, give me the first one. Oh, you're a task. That allows it to create this part of the URL. And then it asks the next one, what are you? And it says, I'm a note. So it knows to create the notes URL after that. And that's because Rails uses this convention over configuration so that it will just know how to create that URL. So that's really nice. And we refresh, and we have this new note right here. And when we click create note, you notice nothing really happened. And when that happens, looking at our server log right here, you can see that we have this error message. And again, you got to scroll up and find that method right here. And it says the create could not be found in the notes controller. So we have to create that create action. So we want to create a create method, and we can say that the note equals a note.new, and then we can pass in the params that belong to that note. But just like in the task, when we did the task method, it's much better. We're going to need this for the update too, to create a method, private method here called note params. And the note params will require that there be a note with a title, and it will allow us to set the title and body on that note. So we can just call that method here, and it will return us all the title and the body so we can create that new note. Now, if you notice the note, it needs to belong to the task. So what we can do here is we could say note.task equals @task. And then we can just save it the way that we did with the task controller. So we can say if note.save, and we can do that. But there's actually a little shortcut here, and we can say @task.notes, and we can append the new note right onto it. And this will return true or false if it works or not. And basically what it will do is it will assign the task ID in this note so that it belongs to this task, and that will try to save the note. So if it works, then we will have a success. So we can redirect to the task notes path. This will be the path with all of the notes. Actually, we probably want to just see that note. So just the show view for this new note that we created. So we'll have to pass in the task and the note this time. So notice we have to pass in both the task and the note to this so that it can add the ID of the task and the ID of the note. So this will create a URL that says task/3 notes and the ID of the note that we created. And we can also add a notice for the note created. And then if it's not able to save it in the database, we want to render out the new form, just like we did in the task model. So we do that with a render call, and we say the status is an unprocessable entity. So now when we try this, when we click create note, it needs a title, and this is our first UI note. And we can try to create that note. And now it says the note's been created, but we're still on this new method here. But looking back in our console log, and the reason why the error doesn't show up is a thing with Turbo, but we can see that we have the show action cannot be found for the notes controller. So let's go ahead and create that show action now. And we want to load, we already loaded the task out of the database. So now we want to load the note out of the database. So we can say note equals note.find. And we'll use params the ID. Now, if you notice this URL that we have will have a ID for both the task and the notes and the note. And just the ID gets the ID of the note, and task ID down here gets the ID of the task. But just like we did in the task controller, we should probably do that in a before action. So we'll have a load note method. And we'll just do this inside of that load note. And now we already have that show action. So now we just need to add a new view here. So the show.html.erb. And we can add a title saying the note for that. And let's go ahead, and we already have this div tag. Let's go ahead and reuse that by putting this into a partial. So all I'm doing here is I'm taking this on my index page, I'm taking this out, and I'm putting it into the new partial I created. And we got to make sure that we access this through the note, which it already does. It doesn't have the @ in front of it. Then on the index path, we can get rid of this, and we can just say render the task notes. And then that should render all of the notes. And then in our show view, let's go ahead and save that. In the show view here, we can do the same thing and render the note. Now, one thing I forgot is back in the controller, the notes controller, we don't want to try to load a note out of our database for the index, new, or create action, just like we did in the task controller. We only want it in the show and the other, that to show up in the show and the other methods that we're going to add later. So let's try creating our second UI task. By the way, the first UI task was created, but when we redirect it to the show page, that's what didn't work. So now here's our second UI task, and you can see that we see that as a body. So that seemed to work. Now let's go ahead and try to create a note for a different task. Remember that these are we got the 3 notes for this task, the one we created in console and the 2 we created through the web. But if we go to this task right here, the finish task controller task, and we can see that it doesn't have any notes, but let's go ahead and create the finish note here. And when we go to the task in the finish controller, it has one note. And we go back to the task in the validator. The validated task has 3 notes right here. This second task right here, let's go ahead and try to view that. And is that note number 4 is the second UI task. But what if we go up here to this URL and we say note number 5, and notice that this finish note does not belong to the validated task. That belongs to this finish task controller. So that doesn't seem like a big deal. I mean, as long as we get our links right, people will click on the right links. But for security reasons, let's say that this had to do with credit cards, and a credit card belonged to one user and another credit card belonged to another user, and the users went up here to the URL and they started messing with the ID up here, and they're able to get credit cards that don't belong to them, and that could be a big security hole. So let's fix that. Now, the full reason why that's happening is when we load a node out, we just load the node independent of the task ID. So we don't check to see if this node actually belongs to the task that was loaded out in the URL. So to fix that, we'll just take our task that hopefully is already loaded out and it has notes. And then we could do a find on the notes. That way it'll ensure that the notes belong to this task and not to some other task. So that will fix any security holes of doing that. So now if we go back to our task, we got our validated task, we got our notes, and we can go view note number 4 is just fine because that belongs to task number 3, but note number 5 here belongs to task number 4, and so what we're getting here is a record not found. Now this seems like an error, but what will happen when we deploy this to production is we'll just get a page not found error, and that is just fine. That's exactly what we want to have happen, is a page not found. So when they mess with the URL and don't get their notes out, then we'll just see page not found, and then they won't try it anymore. So let's go ahead and clean up some of the navigation on this site. There's no link to go back from here. When we're tasks, if we view a task and we go to the notes, there's no link to get back to the task, and there's also no link to get from a list of notes to a single note. So let's go ahead and add those in. Okay, so we're viewing a task, and now we can click notes, and we can see all the notes, and I added in a link to see each individual note. There's now a link to go back to all of the notes, and down here there's a link to go back to the task. So I'll show you the code that does that. So first of all, in the notes partial here, I did the same thing that we did with the task, and I used the link to and less current, and that will print out the title, and it will make it a link if we're not viewing this specific note. And if we are viewing this specific note, then we'll just have the title in plain text. So back on the show view of a note, so we're viewing one note, and now I just created a link to go back to the task notes path, and this is the page that prints out all of our notes for a specific task. We have to include the task in so that it can include the task ID, and that gives that link there. And back on the index page, and again this is the notes index page that prints out all of our notes, I added a link here that says back to task, and we're just going to go to the task show page. So it's just a task path. Of course, we need the ID so that we know which task we want to go there. So what remains is doing the update and the delete. So we can add on this show page, when we're viewing one note, we can add links to both edit and delete this note. And I'm going to do the update, edit, delete off camera, and then I'll come back and show you the code that does it. And I'm not going to work through it all because it's basically the same that we did for the task back in the controller video. Okay, so now if we click on a notes and we click on a single note, you'll see that I have an edit note button and a delete note button, or at least a link in a button. And that way we can edit and delete this note. If we go ahead and click on edit, we're presented with a form that can edit this note. If we submit this form without a title, then it presents an error. And then we can go ahead and say updated up here, and that updates the title of the note, and we're back here with the note updated. And then, of course, we can delete the note. We get this confirmation, are you sure? Click OK, and now the note's been deleted. So let's go and see the code that does all of that. So we'll cover the edit first, and here is the link to edit a note. It's called, it just says edit note, and the path that we want to go to is the edit task note path. Notice we need to include both the task and the note there, and that will generate a link with the task and some task ID, and then a note with some note ID, and then it will have edit on the end of it. So that's what that creates, and when you click on that link, we're going to go to the controller, the notes controller, and you can see the edit method doesn't appear to do much, but remember we have these before actions up here, one that's going to load the task and another one that's going to load the note. Now, by the way, it's important that we do these two before actions, that we list them as the task first and the note second. That way we'll load the task out. That way when we go to load the note, the at task is not nil. And one kind of confusing error with Ruby is when if this were nil and we try to call notes on it, we wouldn't say that at task is nil. The error we'd say is, hey, you try to call notes on the class or the object nil, and nil does not have a notes method on it. So that's kind of the error that we get in Ruby. But anyway, we load both the task and the note out, and of course we go to render in the edit view, and just like in the edit task, we're going to render a form. So I added a new form, partial underscore form, right here. I took the form out of the new view, so I just cut that out and I replaced it with a render form on the new one. That way we can have a single form for both the edit and the create. And if you look at your task edit form, it's pretty much the same. We have this little ternary operator that asks if the note's already been saved in the database. So if it has, and it will say update note, and if it hasn't, it'll say create note. And so that's the edit. And then going back to the notes controller, we'll see the update. And just like our task update, we're going to go ahead and try to update the note using this notes param method that will let us update the title and the body. And so it'll update that, and if that works, then we'll redirect to the task note path where we can see the changes that we just made, and we'll have a notice of updated. And I'll add a period there. And then if it doesn't work, then we're going to render the edit view with the status unprocessable entity, and that will present the form again with an error message saying you need to fix the errors. Let's go back to the delete and see how that works. So this is an alternative. What I could do there instead is I could have said go to the task note path, and if you know from your RESTful routing, when we do a delete request to the task note path, and that calls the destroy method on our controller. But this is a shortcut for this. This task note path would have to include both the task and the note in there. So we can use either this one or this one. But this is a little Ruby shortcut magic, or at least rel shortcut magic. It asks, hey, what are you? And it says, I'm an array. And then it asks, what's the first thing? Oh, I'm a task. And then it asks what the second thing is. It says, oh, I'm a note. So it'll automatically generate the task note path for you. And of course, we want to delete. And this is for the JavaScript to pop up the are you sure message. And so once we do that, then the notes controller gets called. Remember, we're going to load the task and the note with a before action, and then we're just going to destroy the note and redirect them back to the task notes path. So we're going to view all of the notes, not a single note, and we'll have an alert saying note deleted, which is what we got when we deleted the note. So That's all I'm going to cover in this video. There are some shortcuts. If you notice, this app has a lot of links that we have to click. So we want to see the notes, we can click there. And now that we're seeing the notes, if we want to see one note, we can click there. This page you might not want it. You might not want a page that shows a single note. And what we could do is just have this page that has all the notes and embed the edit and the destroy buttons underneath the note that way as well. We can also take this list right here and list it right below on the task show page, so we can have all of our notes listed right here instead of having to click another link to see the notes. So, and then once we do that, you can do a lot of styling here. You can make this look really prominent, and then you can have the notes just kind of look like a comment section down here below it. And then you could even include the form to create a new note for this task on the same page. That way, all the information is all on the same page. But since this video is already getting kind of long, I'll just stop there and leave it to you to organize the site how you want. Just make sure it's user-friendly and intuitive. I highly recommend getting someone else to kind of use your site and you just kind of look over their shoulder and make sure that they're figuring out how your site works correctly, and if there are problems, then you can correct it from there. Anyways, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video where we're going to implement user authentication.